I hate what I was. I will never be that person again, ever. I don't care if they kill me. I don't care if I live to be 1,000 years old. I will never be what I was before because I hate what I did. I'm so sorry for what I did.
I never thought it would come to this, Sean Sellers whispered, his words hanging in the air like a chilling confession. The weight of what he had done, a 16-year-old boy who took the lives of his own mother and stepfather, was beyond comprehension. The community in Oklahoma was left reeling, struggling to piece together how a teenager could commit such brutal acts. But there was no answer. Not yet. Sean Richard Sellers, at just 16 years old, became one of the youngest individuals to be sentenced to death in the United States. His story is one that captured the attention of the nation, not just because of the brutal murders he committed, but because of the complex web of mental health, trauma, and a broken justice system that surrounded his case. Over the course of this episode, we will follow the timeline of events that led to Sean's arrest, the shocking details of his crimes, and the legal battles that ignited debates about juvenile punishment and mental illness. But this isn't just a story of a cold-blooded killer. It's a tale that forces us to confront the deeper issues of our society. How far do we go when punishing a teenager with such a troubled past? Before we move deeper into Sean Sellers' tragic story, I want to ask you, have you ever encountered someone who, despite all their potential, spirals into darkness? Or perhaps you've heard stories of troubled teens in your own community, and it leaves you wondering, how could something like this happen? The line between mental illness, trauma, and violent crime is often a thin one, and the way we handle these cases can be life or death. Let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever been touched by a case like this, whether through your community or your own experiences. Drop a comment below and make sure to subscribe, because this video will not only reveal a shocking crime, but also explore the psychological, emotional, and legal sides of this heartbreaking case. Sean's journey into darkness is one that questions how much of our past shapes our future. As we unpack Sean Sellers' story, we'll explore the chilling timeline of his actions, starting from his difficult childhood and the early signs of mental instability. We'll walk through the critical moments, the first murder of Robert Bauer, the shocking murders of his mother and stepfather, and his eventual arrest and confession. But this case doesn't just end with the crimes themselves. It opens up a larger conversation about the justice system's treatment of mentally ill juveniles. Was Sean's death sentence truly justice, or was it a tragedy on top of a tragedy? Along the way, we'll also delve into the legal and psychological battles that followed his conviction, debates that continue to echo in courtrooms today. This isn't just a case about murder. It's about how we, as a society, choose to handle those who break the law, especially when mental illness and trauma play such a significant role. Stick with me as we peel back the layers of this case and reveal the complexities hidden beneath the surface. Now we're ready to begin our journey through the haunting case of Sean Richard Sellers. As we explore the circumstances that led to his actions, it's crucial to understand that this story doesn't just deal with the crime. It digs deep into the psychological and emotional landscape of a young boy whose life was shaped by neglect, isolation, and mental illness. We'll examine his troubled upbringing, how early trauma left scars that would shape his future, and how these unresolved issues ultimately led to the unthinkable. We'll also take a hard look at the aftermath, how a young boy, who committed horrific acts, was treated by the justice system. Was he a victim of his circumstances, or was he solely responsible for his actions? The questions are complex, and the answers are far from simple. But this case forces us to confront tough truths about accountability, the law, and the system's treatment of troubled youth. The deeper we dig, the more we'll uncover about how easily a life can spiral out of control when support and intervention come too late. Sean's story is one that raises more questions than answers. How does someone so young, just 16, commit such shocking acts of violence? How does a person grow up with so much potential yet turn to murder? Was it his upbringing, his mental state, or something deeper that led him to this point? As we explore his life, crimes, and the aftermath, I encourage you to think about these questions and what they say about us as a society. How do we respond when the system fails to intervene in time? And more importantly, what happens when we fail to understand the complexities of mental illness and trauma? Stay with me as we uncover the disturbing journey of Sean Sellers and discover the moral and psychological dilemmas that still resonate today. By the end of this episode, you'll not only understand the facts of the case, but also the larger implications of justice, rehabilitation, and redemption. This case isn't just about what happened, it's about what could have been done differently. Sean Richard Sellers was born on May 18, 1969, in Corcoran, California, to a teenage mother and an alcoholic father. His mother, Vonda, was only 16 when she gave birth to Sean, and his father, a man struggling with addiction, was not in the picture for long. By the time Sean was 3 or 4 years old, his parents divorced, leaving him with a sense of instability from the very beginning. His mother, in search of stability for herself and her son, remarried a truck driver named Paul Bellofato when Sean was still young. However, Sean's life didn't settle into normalcy after the remarriage. In fact, it only became more chaotic. His mother's second marriage did little to provide him the emotional security he needed. In fact, the Bellofato household would prove to be even more difficult to navigate. Constant moves meant that Sean never stayed in one place for long. Over the course of his young life, he would live in over 30 different homes, moving between relatives, new step-siblings, and various homes in different states. By the time he reached adolescence, Sean had attended more schools than most children would in a lifetime. The frequent relocation and lack of a stable home base had profound psychological effects on Sean. He found it difficult to make lasting friendships, and the sense of belonging he so desperately needed was always just out of reach. As a result, he began to feel more and more isolated. His mother's repeated attempts at finding happiness through relationships only served to deepen Sean's feeling of abandonment. Paul Bellofato, his stepfather, was an emotionally distant figure. As a truck driver, he was often away, and when he was around, his attention was rarely on Sean. Vonda, busy with her own emotional struggles, failed to provide the support and care that Sean so desperately craved. But the real emotional toll came from the abusive treatment Sean endured at the hands of his family. Reports from his early years would later reveal that his maternal grandfather and stepfather subjected him to physical and emotional abuse. On more than one occasion, he was the victim of cruel punishment, including being forced to wear soiled diapers on his head as a form of discipline. These events left deep emotional scars on Sean, creating feelings of anger, resentment, and confusion. For much of his early life, Sean was a boy without anyone to turn to, without the guidance or protection of the adults who were supposed to care for him. It wasn't just the physical abuse that took a toll on Sean. It was the emotional neglect that left him feeling invisible, worthless, and powerless. His mother, despite her best efforts, was never able to provide the stability or love that Sean needed. Her own struggles with relationships and her inability to protect him left Sean with the overwhelming sense that he was alone in the world. This feeling of isolation became a theme that would follow him into adulthood. At an early age, Sean learned to shut himself off from the world. He spent a significant amount of time alone, retreating into his own mind. His obsession with order and control was a direct result of the chaos he experienced in his life. As Sean grew older, his need for control became more pronounced. He began to develop obsessive-compulsive behaviors, such as arranging objects in certain patterns and checking doors repeatedly for signs of intruders. These behaviors were his way of coping with the overwhelming sense of instability around him. They gave him the illusion of control in a world that had constantly been out of his hands. In addition to these behaviors, Sean began to show signs of a deeper emotional disturbance. He was constantly afraid, constantly on edge, and unable to feel truly safe. The need for security and protection was so strong that, over time, it became the driving force behind many of his decisions. And as the years passed, these feelings would only intensify, ultimately leading him down a path that no one, including Sean himself, could have foreseen. By the time Sean turned 12, the seeds of violence had been planted. The abuse, isolation, and lack of emotional support were all contributing factors to his psychological decline. Yet no one seemed to notice the warning signs, at least not until it was too late. Sean was a child who was deeply troubled, but his struggles were buried under layers of emotional pain, making it almost impossible for others to see. As Sean entered his teenage years, the foundation of mental instability began to take root in earnest. What was once a series of troubling behaviors began to transform into a full-fledged psychological breakdown. By the age of 13, Sean was no longer just an isolated and troubled child. He was someone deeply consumed by fear, paranoia, and the need to exert control over his world. It was during these formative years that Sean developed an obsession with Satanism and the occult. For many teenagers, rebellion and curiosity may lead them to experiment with different ideologies or philosophies. But for Sean, Satanism became more than just an intellectual curiosity. It was his way of seeking power and control in a life that had stripped him of both. As he delved deeper into occult rituals, Sean began to see Satanism not just as a belief system, but as a tool for exerting power over his own existence. He believed that embracing darkness would allow him to escape the trauma of his past and impose order on his chaotic mind. The more he immersed himself in these dark practices, the more detached Sean became from reality. He began to develop what could only be described as a dual identity, one that was deeply entrenched in the rituals of the occult, and another that was constantly battling the fear of his own mind. The voices he heard were not simply whispers, they were demands. They told him what to do, where to go, and how to think. In his mind, the voices gave him clarity and direction, even though they pushed him further away from reality. At the same time, Sean's emotional state was deteriorating. He began engaging in self-destructive behaviors, cutting himself, obsessively arranging items in his room, and spending hours in solitude became his coping mechanisms. These behaviors, once subtle, began to escalate, and it became clear that Sean was no longer in control of his own mind. He wasn't simply experimenting with rituals for thrill or curiosity. He was losing himself to a distorted version of reality, one where violence was not only acceptable but inevitable. What's even more disturbing was that, despite these obvious signs of mental decline, no one intervened. The adults in Sean's life were either too preoccupied with their own issues or completely unaware of the severity of his condition. His stepfather, Paul Belifato, remained emotionally distant, rarely engaging with Sean on any meaningful level. Vonda, his mother, had her own emotional struggles and failed to provide the nurturing environment Sean so desperately needed. In the absence of guidance, support, or a safe space to express his feelings, Sean turned inward, developing an even deeper sense of isolation. As his thoughts grew darker and more violent, his connection to the real world faded. Sean began to view the people around him not as family or friends, but as obstacles to his desire for control. The people he was supposed to trust became mere pieces in a game he felt he needed to control. It was at this point that Sean's obsession with good versus evil became a driving force in his actions. In his mind, those who opposed him, those who wronged him, were part of the enemy. And in the world Sean created, those who were part of the enemy needed to be eliminated. During this period, Sean's relationship with his friend Richard Howard took on a more significant role. They bonded over their shared interests in the occult and Satanism, and Howard became someone with whom Sean could discuss his darkest thoughts. Their friendship wasn't rooted in anything healthy. Rather, it was an outlet for Sean's growing desire to act on his violent impulses. Howard, who was himself deeply troubled, didn't stop Sean or suggest seeking help. He simply became an accomplice to Sean's twisted worldview. As Sean's isolation deepened, Howard became one of the few people with whom he could share his destructive fantasies. Despite his deepening madness, Sean maintained a certain level of control, a terrifying ability to mask his instability from the outside world. He was able to function in a way that allowed him to move through society unnoticed, while internally, he was slipping further away from reality. As Sean's fantasies of violence began to solidify, he became convinced that something needed to be done. something drastic, to rid himself of the perceived threats that plagued his thoughts. The stage was set, and the consequences of Sean's growing instability would soon be realized in a way that no one could have predicted. It was a seemingly mundane day when Sean Sellers first took a life, a day that would forever mark the beginning of his violent descent. On September 8, 1985, Sean, along with his friend Richard Howard, went to a convenience store in Oklahoma. The reason? A trivial confrontation, an argument over the sale of alcohol. Robert Paul Bauer, a 32-year-old store clerk, refused to sell beer to Sean and Howard, a decision that would ultimately lead to Bauer's death. For most people, the refusal to sell alcohol would have been a minor inconvenience. But for Sean, it was an insult, a challenge to his authority. At that moment, something inside him snapped, and the violence he had been harboring in his mind for so long finally erupted. He needed to prove to himself, perhaps more than anyone else, that he had control over his world. And in his twisted thinking, killing was the ultimate way to seize that control. Sean and Richard left the store but didn't walk away. Sean had brought a .22 caliber handgun with him, hidden under his clothing. The decision to kill wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, premeditated. After all, this wasn't the first time Sean had fantasized about taking a life. In fact, it was the culmination of months of obsession, anger, and psychological turmoil. For Sean, this wasn't about rage. It was about control. After leaving the store, Sean and Howard circled back to the store in their car. Sean, with the gun now in his hand, approached the counter, walked up to Bauer, and demanded that he hand over the money in the register. Bauer, understandably confused and likely scared, refused. In that moment, Sean didn't hesitate. He raised the gun and shot Bauer in cold blood. The violence was swift and efficient, designed to eliminate any obstacle in his way. The murder was shocking in its brutality and calculated in its execution. But what was even more chilling was Sean's behavior after the fact. Rather than feeling the weight of what he had just done, Sean showed no signs of remorse or regret. He simply turned to his friend Richard, matter-of-factly stating that he had killed Bauer. There was no sense of guilt, just an eerie calmness, as if it was a necessary step in fulfilling his need for control. The immediate aftermath of the murder was, as expected, chaotic. Richard Howard helped Sean dispose of the gun, an accessory to the crime, but it was clear that neither boy fully understood the magnitude of what had happened. While they may have believed they had gotten away with the crime, they couldn't shake the feeling that their actions would eventually catch up to them. For the community, the murder of Robert Paul Bauer was a rude awakening. How could a teenager commit such an act? The convenience store clerk, a father and a husband, had been killed for a simple disagreement over a sale. But this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was the first sign that Sean's inner turmoil had reached a boiling point. The world had just witnessed the transformation of a boy into something far darker. The next few months would only serve to show just how far Sean would go to exercise the control he so desperately craved. In a way, the murder of Robert Bauer was the spark. It ignited a series of events that would culminate in further violence, irreversible damage, and ultimately, a tragic loss of potential. The case of Sean Sellers would become one of the most talked about juvenile murder cases in the country, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the psychological puzzle it presented. How does a teenager, still technically a child, descend into such darkness? How could someone with so much promise turn into a killer? The arrest and trial of Sean Sellers would ultimately shed more light on his troubled past, his mental health struggles, and his inability to control the inner demons that had driven him to this point. But at that moment, when Robert Bauer's life was taken without warning, the course of Sean's life was set into motion, and the legal and psychological battles that would follow would raise questions about justice, morality, and the treatment of mentally ill juveniles. On March 5, 1986, Sean Sellers committed the second and third murders of his young life. This time, the victims were far closer to him, his own mother, Vonda, and his stepfather, Paul Bellofato. The brutality of these murders was chilling, but what made them even more unsettling was the cold, calculated manner in which Sean carried them out. This was no longer an impulsive act of rage. It was premeditated, executed with chilling precision. By this time, Sean had spent months spiraling deeper into mental instability. The violence he had already committed left him feeling untouchable, as if he had proven something to himself, that he could take control over his life by taking control over the lives of others. But the psychological toll of living with such intense isolation, anger, and a growing sense of paranoia had begun to weigh heavily on him. His family, despite being a constant presence in his life, felt distant and disconnected. His mother, despite the love she may have had for him, was emotionally unavailable. Paul Belafato, his stepfather, was an almost indifferent figure in his life, a man who was rarely present, and when he was, often distant and cold. The simmering tension within Sean's mind reached a boiling point that night. He had been planning the murders for days, growing increasingly agitated and fixated on the idea that he needed to eliminate the people closest to him. In his mind, they had become obstacles, reminders of a life that had failed him. And in his mind, they needed to be removed. That night, Sean carefully prepared. He wore only his underwear to minimize the chance of blood spatter, a chilling sign of how much thought had gone into his plan. He quietly moved through the house, slipping into the room where his mother and stepfather slept. In a swift and brutal action, Sean shot both of them while they were in bed, killing them instantly. He didn't wait for them to wake up. There was no struggle, no pleading for their lives. It was a cold, methodical act of murder. Afterward, Sean arranged the crime scene in an attempt to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He staged the scene to confuse investigators, trying to make it appear as though the killers had been after valuables. But this wasn't about a robbery. It was about control. For Sean, the murder of his mother and stepfather wasn't just about ending their lives. It was about asserting dominance and proving that he could control his fate in ways he never had before. The aftermath of the murders was haunting. Sean didn't seem affected by what he had done. Instead of feeling remorse, he seemed almost indifferent to the gravity of the situation. The emotional detachment he exhibited was disturbing. Rather than being racked with guilt, he confessed to his friend Richard Howard in a matter-of-fact tone. Sean had killed his mother and stepfather, but to him, it was just another action in a long line of events that he felt he needed to control. He even went so far as to hide the weapon and attempt to dispose of the evidence, showing a chilling level of awareness about what he had done. It wasn't until the following day that Sean's actions would start to unravel. The community was shocked. How could a teenage boy kill his own family? The sense of disbelief spread like wildfire, but it was the lack of emotion in Sean's behavior that raised the most questions. Was this just a cold-blooded act of revenge, or was there something more deeply troubling at play? The murders of Vonda and Paul Belafato set the stage for a legal and psychological battle that would continue long after Sean's arrest. The question that would loom large in the trial was whether Sean should be treated as a juvenile offender or an adult. Could his mental illness, his history of abuse, and the emotional trauma he had endured throughout his life be used to justify his actions? Or was he simply a young man who chose to commit a series of heinous acts, taking the lives of the people closest to him in cold blood? At the time of the murders, Sean Sellers was 16 years old. He was still considered a child by the law, but the way he had orchestrated the killings, the premeditation, the lack of remorse, and the chilling calmness with which he carried out the crime, made it clear that he was not an average teenager. The psychological complexities of his case would become the focal point of the investigation and trial, forcing experts, lawyers, and the public to wrestle with difficult moral questions. What did these murders reveal about Sean Sellers? Was he a product of his environment, shaped by years of abuse and neglect? Or was he simply a young man who had made a choice to end the lives of his mother and stepfather? The complexities of his case would unfold in the courtroom, but for now, the world was left with one terrifying fact. A 16-year-old boy had just murdered his family, and the ramifications of that act would be felt far beyond the immediate victims. The day after the brutal murders of Vonda and Paul Belafato, Sean Sellers' life would take a dramatic turn. The police quickly identified the crime scene as a homicide and began investigating. But Sean, despite the grisly nature of his actions, didn't attempt to flee or hide his involvement. Instead, he remained calm and detached, revealing a chilling lack of remorse. It wasn't long before Sean was arrested and brought in for questioning. The police, unsure of how to approach a teenager with such an unsettling demeanor, quickly realized that they were dealing with someone far more complicated than the average suspect. When questioned about the murders, Sean gave a matter-of-fact confession. He did not seem particularly disturbed by what he had done. In fact, he spoke with a calmness that seemed out of place given the violence of his crimes. There was no emotional breakdown, no signs of regret, just a cold, detached account of the killings. "I killed them both, it was just something I had to do," Sean stated in his confession, which sent a shiver down the spine of everyone in the room. To those listening, it felt as though Sean had crossed an irreversible line, and the emotional weight of the situation was lost on him entirely. The chilling nature of his confession was more than just the recounting of a crime. It was a clear indication that Sean viewed his actions as part of a larger plan, a plan he felt he had control over. What followed was a drawn-out legal battle that would ultimately become a test case for how the justice system handles juveniles charged with murder. Sean's defense team argued that his mental state, which included a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder, DID, was a critical factor in his actions. They claimed that Sean had a number of alternate personalities, some of which were unaware of the violent acts carried out by the others. According to the defense, Sean's actions were not entirely under his control. This, they argued, was proof that he was not fully responsible for the murders of his mother and stepfather. The prosecution, however, had a different argument.
What I could say today, it could cause you to have any mercy on me whatsoever. But I know I didn't come here to ask for justice. I came here to beg for mercy.
Mercy? Sympathy? Much more. We'll need our sick bags in here.
We are shocked to find ourselves here in your presence, pleading to you to allow the death sentence of Sean Sellers to go forward and allow him to be executed.
They focused on the premeditation and methodical nature of the killings. The fact that Sean had planned the murders, carefully choosing his attire to minimize blood spatter, and attempting to stage the crime scene to look like a robbery, made it clear that these were not acts of spontaneous violence. Instead, the prosecution painted a picture of a young man who had made a deliberate decision to take the lives of his own family members. The lack of emotion Sean exhibited throughout the investigation and trial only added to the chilling nature of his crime. The prosecution's case was strong. They emphasized the calculated nature of the murders and argued that, despite Sean's mental health issues, he was still capable of understanding the consequences of his actions. The jury, tasked with determining Sean's fate, was faced with an agonizing decision. The defense argued for leniency, pointing to Sean's age and mental health, while the prosecution pressed for a severe sentence, pointing out the calculated brutality of the murders. Ultimately, after a period of deliberation, the jury found Sean Sellers guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The decision was not easy, and it sparked a larger conversation about the treatment of juveniles in the criminal justice system. The jury, however, delivered a verdict that shocked many.
Incarceration is commanded to put you to death.
Sean was sentenced to death. At just 16 years old, Sean Sellers became one of the youngest people in the United States to ever receive a death sentence. The public reaction to the case was mixed. Some argued that a juvenile, especially one with a documented history of mental illness, should never be sentenced to death. They pointed to Sean's troubled past, his mental health diagnoses, and his age as reasons why he should be given the chance for rehabilitation. Others, however, felt that the nature of his crimes was too horrific to ignore, and that Sean's actions were so cold and calculated that they warranted the harshest penalty available. Despite the controversy surrounding the case, the conviction stood. The questions about whether the justice system had failed Sean Sellers, or whether it had made the right call, would continue to be debated for years to come. His trial had become a flashpoint in the debate over the death penalty for minors, especially those with mental health issues. But regardless of the legal debates, The reality of Sean's situation was undeniable. He had committed heinous crimes, and he would now be held accountable for them by a justice system that saw him as both a victim of his circumstances and a dangerous criminal who could not be trusted to live freely. As Sean awaited his execution, his case would continue to prompt reflection on the moral dilemmas facing the criminal justice system, particularly in cases involving mentally ill minors. Was he a victim of his circumstances, or was he simply a young man who made the conscious decision to take the lives of those closest to him? The legacy of Sean's case would resonate for years, and it would continue to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring early signs of mental illness, especially in young people. As Sean Sellers sat in prison, awaiting his fate, the case continued to evolve, particularly regarding the central issue of his mental health. At the time of his conviction, Sean was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, DID, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. His defense team argued that this diagnosis was a key factor in his actions and played a significant role in the crimes he committed. Dissociative identity disorder is a complex mental health condition in which a person experiences two or more distinct personalities, each with its own behaviors, memories, and ways of interacting with the world. In Sean's case, his defense attorneys claimed that he had developed multiple personalities, each one emerging at different times. One of these alternate personalities, Danny, was described as being left-handed, while Sean was right-handed. His defense team argued that Danny was the personality responsible for carrying out the murders. According to their claim, Sean was unaware of the actions taken by his alternate personality during the killings, and this made him incapable of being fully responsible for his actions. To further support their argument, the defense team presented expert psychiatric testimony that highlighted the presence of distinct personality shifts in Sean. EEG, electroencephalogram, tests showed abnormal brain activity that appeared to correspond with the emergence of different personalities. These findings were significant, as they provided some scientific backing to the claim that Sean's mind had fractured in a way that influenced his behavior. Despite the defense's efforts, the courts were skeptical of the DID argument. The prosecution countered that while Sean's mental health was certainly a factor, it did not absolve him of the crimes he had committed. They pointed out that Sean had shown a high level of premeditation and awareness when planning and executing the murders. The fact that he took steps to cover his tracks and hide the weapon suggested a level of intent that was difficult to dismiss as the result of mental illness alone. According to the prosecution, Sean was fully aware of what he was doing when he committed the murders, and his mental illness should not be used as an excuse for his actions. As the appeals process unfolded, the central issue remained whether or not Sean's mental state should be taken into consideration when determining his punishment. His defense attorneys argued that Sean's diagnosis of DID and his troubled upbringing, marked by emotional, physical abuse, and neglect, made him a victim of circumstances. They contended that he was not a typical criminal, but rather someone who had been broken by a system that had failed him at every turn. Despite these arguments, the appeals courts rejected the defense's claims, stating that the mental health defense had been adequately considered during the trial. They pointed out that Sean had already been given a fair opportunity to present evidence about his mental illness, and the jury had found him guilty based on the evidence presented. Furthermore, the court ruled that the death penalty was appropriate for the severity of his crimes. As the legal process continued, Sean's case attracted significant attention, not only because of the gruesome nature of the murders, but also because of the larger issues it raised about juvenile justice, mental illness, and the death penalty. The case sparked debates across the country and even internationally. Human rights organizations such as Amnesty International voiced their concerns over the execution of minors, especially those with diagnosed mental health conditions. The execution of a juvenile offender, they argued, was in violation of international standards and should be prohibited under both human rights law and ethical guidelines. In 1999, after years of legal battles, Sean Sellers' execution was scheduled. His case would become one of the last in the United States to involve the death penalty for a juvenile offender. Many believe that Sean's case could have been a turning point for how juveniles, particularly those with mental illness, were treated within the criminal justice system. The debate over juvenile justice continued to intensify, with Sean's execution serving as a stark reminder of the difficulties in balancing justice and rehabilitation for young offenders. Despite his attorney's attempts to halt the execution, Sean was put to death by lethal injection on February 4, 1999. He was just 29 years old. The execution of a mentally ill teenager sparked outrage both in the United States and abroad. Many wondered if the justice system had done enough to consider all factors, including his mental health, before making such a final decision. On February 4, 1999, Sean Sellers was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. At just 29 years old, Sean became the youngest person in the United States to be executed for a crime committed as a juvenile, since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. His execution marked the culmination of a legal battle that had lasted over a decade, filled with debates over juvenile justice, mental illness, and the ethical implications of executing minors. Sean's execution was met with mixed reactions both nationally and internationally. To many in Oklahoma, the sentence seemed justified. The brutality of his crimes, especially the cold-blooded murder of his mother and stepfather, left a lasting scar on the community. For many, Sean's death was seen as the only fitting response to the violence he had inflicted. His calculated actions, his lack of remorse, and his brutal disregard for human life made it clear that justice needed to be served, and the death penalty was the most severe form of accountability. However, Sean's case attracted significant international attention, with human rights groups decrying the execution of a mentally ill juvenile. Amnesty International, among others, argued that executing minors, especially those with documented mental health issues, violated international human rights standards. They contended that juvenile offenders should never face the death penalty, regardless of the severity of their crimes. In this context, Sean's execution was not just a legal issue, it became a symbol of the ongoing debate about the use of the death penalty for young offenders, particularly those with severe mental health challenges. In the United States, the case sparked intense discussions about the fairness of executing individuals who committed crimes while under the age of 18. Critics of the death penalty argued that children are not fully capable of understanding the consequences of their actions and should not face the ultimate punishment. Moreover, when mental illness is involved, as it was with Sean, many felt that the justice system had failed to consider all mitigating factors. Despite the controversies surrounding his execution, the day Sean Sellers was put to death was filled with emotion. The prison, the courts, and even the public were divided. Some believed that justice had been served, while others saw it as a tragic consequence of a broken system, one that had failed to intervene at crucial points in Sean's life, leading to his eventual demise. Sean's execution didn't just mark the end of his life. It was the beginning of a larger conversation about the death penalty, juvenile justice, and mental health. His case raised more questions than it answered, forcing society to reckon with difficult truths about punishment, rehabilitation, and the treatment of minors within the criminal justice system. For some, Sean Sellers' death was a necessary act of justice. For others, it was a sad reminder of a life destroyed by trauma, neglect, and a system that failed to provide the intervention he so desperately needed. The story of Sean Sellers is one that leaves behind a complex and unsettling legacy, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about the intersection of mental illness, juvenile justice, and the death penalty. While his actions were undeniably horrific, Sean's case raises crucial questions about responsibility, rehabilitation, and the role of society in addressing the root causes of violent behavior. Sean's story is a tragic reminder of the devastating impact that childhood abuse and neglect can have on a young person's psychological development. From a very early age, Sean was deprived of the stability and emotional security that most children need to grow into healthy, well-adjusted adults. His unstable home life, coupled with physical and emotional abuse, set the stage for his eventual mental breakdown. The trauma he endured shaped the way he viewed the world, through a lens of fear, paranoia, and distrust. Yet, despite the immense challenges Sean faced, it is impossible to ignore the fact that his actions ultimately led to the deaths of 3 people. This tragic outcome raises important questions about accountability. Should someone who has experienced significant trauma and mental illness be held to the same standards of responsibility as someone without such a history? Is it fair to apply the same punishments to someone who may not have had the emotional or psychological capacity to understand the full weight of their actions? The case also shines a spotlight on the limitations of the justice system, particularly when it comes to handling juvenile offenders. Juvenile offenders like Sean often come from backgrounds filled with dysfunction, abuse, and untreated mental health issues. The system, however, is not always equipped to address these underlying factors. Sean's defense team argued that his mental health and dissociative identity disorder, DID, played a major role in his actions, but the court was focused on his intent, given the calculated nature of his crimes. This tension between mental illness and criminal responsibility has been at the heart of countless legal debates and continues to be a key issue in the sentencing of juveniles in the criminal justice system. Sean's case also forces us to reflect on the role of society in preventing such tragedies. Mental health awareness and early intervention could have made a significant difference in Sean's life. If mental health services, counseling, and proper support systems had been in place during his childhood, perhaps he could have received the help he desperately needed before his actions escalated into violence. Children who experience trauma need a system that offers them a pathway to healing, not one that simply condemns them when they cross the line. While it's difficult to argue that Sean's crimes were anything less than horrific, it's also hard to ignore the reality that he was a product of his environment, a system that failed him at every turn. The lack of early intervention, the failure of adults in his life to recognize and address his mental health issues, and the complete breakdown of his emotional well-being all contributed to the horrifying events that followed. Sean Sellers' case forces us to reconsider how we treat minors in the criminal justice system, especially those with mental health disorders. Should we continue to apply the harshest penalties to those who commit crimes as minors, or should we focus on rehabilitation and understanding the underlying causes of their actions? The debate is ongoing, but Sean's case will undoubtedly continue to serve as a powerful reminder of the complexities involved in justice, punishment, and compassion. As we bring Sean Sellers' story to a close, we're left with more questions than answers. Was justice truly served? Was there an opportunity for rehabilitation that was missed? These questions are far from unique to Sean's case. He is just one of many troubled juveniles who are caught in the web of mental illness, abuse, and a system that often fails to intervene in time. While Sean's story is heartbreaking, it's also a cautionary tale, one that should compel us to reevaluate how we treat young offenders and the mentally ill in our criminal justice system. But the discussion doesn't end here. Next week on Dark Justice Files, we'll take you through another case that is equally as compelling and unsettling. This case also involves a troubled young person, a crime that shocked the world, and a society left grappling with questions of justice, morality, and retribution. We'll uncover the disturbing details, explore the psychological factors at play, and examine the legal ramifications of a crime that many thought was impossible. As always, our exploration goes beyond just the facts of the case. It's about understanding the deeper forces at work. How do mental illness, childhood trauma, and a flawed justice system intersect? And how can we, as a society, better address these issues to prevent more tragedies in the future? These are the questions we'll continue to explore with you, our viewers, as we seek answers and shine a light on the darkest corners of crime. So, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Dark Justice Files and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on the next episode. Also, drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts on Sean's case. Do you think the justice system failed him, or did he get what he deserved? Join the conversation and stay tuned as we continue to unravel the most compelling true crime stories out there. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and keep questioning the truth.